Yesterday, we talked about extremism in the military. And specifically, we talked about a new report from the Pentagon that found hundreds of instances of members of the military in all of the branches of the military with a desire to overthrow the government. And one of the things that I mentioned yesterday is that because the United States has an all-volunteer military, there's a self-selection bias that applies. You don't get a cross-section of people in the American military in the way that you would if there was a draft, because the only people in the military are the ones who say, hey, I'd like to join the military. And yesterday I made clear, I'm not advocating for a draft. I'm just pointing out this is the reality. There's a self-selection bias at play. Surprisingly, I received dozens of emails about this, including from progressive members of the military who said, David, I'm in the military. I'm a progressive. My views are quite marginal within the military. I actually believe, this is some in the audience saying, I actually believe if we had a draft, it would fix a lot of the problems with the American military. Culturally, it would fix problems of when the military is used around the world. And you should really reconsider that. So I'm reconsidering it. I'm coming to you today. And the question that I want to explore is whether a military draft is a good idea from a progressive standpoint. And I'll explain to you why I'm wondering about this. Now, again, I want to say I'm not calling for a draft. I'm presenting you with an idea that we can evaluate. Imagine that there were a military draft in today's world. It certainly would lead to a more diverse military, reflecting the fact that there are economic differences in the United States. We're not just talking about race and gender, but we're talking socioeconomic, political beliefs, educational background. If there were a military draft, immediately we would have a far wider representation of different sorts of folks with different backgrounds and from different situations in the military. And arguably that would be good. But there's another reason that the idea of a military draft as a progressive reform is interesting. If you have a draft, you could deepen democratic accountability. And I'll explain to you what I mean. If more citizens or their loved ones were potentially going to have to serve, I would guess that public engagement with military decisions would go way up. Let me give you an example. If I knew that my kid was going to be drafted, I am now going to be way more engaged with what is the military doing? Where is the military being deployed? Making sure that the elected officials we select aren't going to send our military into harm's way when it doesn't make sense or use the military for their personal political goals. I'm maybe not the perfect example because I'm already engaged with that stuff, but there are lots of people who may be more engaged with foreign policy and how the military is being deployed if they or their loved ones may be subject to a draft. And maybe, and this is where we get to the progressive goal, maybe it would lead to a more restrained military approach, something that progressives like me have been advocating for a very long time. Now, there's no question that there are problems with a draft. Does it impinge on freedom? Are volunteers more effective than people who have been conscripted? These are all legitimate questions and things that should be discussed. But there's a larger freedom, arguably, in a society that shares responsibility equally and incentivizes everyone to be engaged with the moral and ethical considerations of how the military is being deployed and so many of these other questions. We've seen the rise in extremist ideology within the military. You could dilute the extremism of the military by drafting people with a wider spectrum of belief. You might create a more balanced force, a more representative force, a more progressive force. So I'm not calling for a draft, but after I mentioned this in passing yesterday and so many people wrote to me and said, no, David, you're on the right track, the question I will leave you with is, could a military draft be something that moves the United States towards a more accountable military, a more diverse defense force, a more equitable and restrained armed forces? It's a complex issue. I want to hear from you about it. Am I maybe on to something here? Or is this analysis worth what you paid for it? which is 0. Let me know in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube. Folks, something happened overnight. 3,000 YouTube subscribers dumped in, like the votes on that day that Trump talks about. And we may actually get to 2 million subscribers today. If we do, everyone on our mailing list will be notified about an ungodly, humiliatingly cheap membership special. Make sure you're on the newsletter, davidpakman.com. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube. So I wrote another book for kids. The first book was Think Like a Detective. The point of the first book was to teach kids critical thinking, which Republicans don't want them to learn, because when kids learn critical thinking, they don't vote for Republicans. The new book is Think Like a Scientist. This is a fun adventure teaching kids the scientific method. Again, Republicans aren't big on kids learning the scientific method, because when they do, they're less likely to fall for Republican lies about climate change and vaccines and so many other things. You can get the new book as well as the first one at davidpakman.com/book. This is part of the Adventures in Thinking series. Can you imagine that we're doing this? We are. davidpakman.com/book. 13,500 copies of the first book have sold. I'll bring you an update soon on sales for the second book. Think Like a Scientist, davidpakman.com/book.